Okay, I think we're going to begin because we're expecting some votes, so this may we may have a little bit of a break. So I want to get as much as we can beforehand. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on threats to civil society around the world. I would like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for taking the time to share their expertise and deep experience with us today. We appreciate your presence. Mr. Kia, let me also take this opportunity to thank you for your 2 terms of service as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Many people the world over have been helped by your work and are very grateful for your efforts. Both as the Commission and as members of Congress committed to human rights, we know the critical role played by civil society organizations and movements, their leaders and their members, in the promotion and protection of human rights around the world. They are the lifeblood of the human rights movement. They play a critical role in pressuring governments to fulfill their human rights obligations in naming and shaming human rights abusers. Civil society groups are also key actors in the education, solidarity, and advocacy of a broad range of critical issues inside their nations. Just as the work of civil society contributes to the recognition and fulfillment of human rights, so too does civil society depend on the realization of human rights, in particular, the fundamental rights to peaceful assembly and association, freedom of expression, and the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. Since 1948, human rights have been recognized as universal, regardless of government or ideology. We are also aware that the ability of citizens to exercise and enjoy their basic human rights often advances the process of democratization. When basic human rights are infringed, the health of civil society is threatened. And when the health of civil society is threatened, all forms of good governance are threatened. Since the 1970s, the world has witnessed a wave of democratic transitions that have been accompanied by explosive growth in the number of civil society organizations covering a broad scope of topics and concerns. But in recent years, we have seen a backlash. Human rights defenders and civil society organizations increasingly face hostile and threatening environments. In 2014 alone, Civicus, an international association of civil society groups, counted, and I quote, significant attacks on the fundamental civil society rights of free association, free assembly, and free expression in 96 countries, end quote. As we will hear today, the specifics of these attacks vary, but there are common trends. Many countries now have laws that close the space for civil society by imposing expensive, arbitrary, or impossibly complex registration requirements, or which limit NGOs from receiving foreign funding or grants. Since 2012, governments around the world have enacted 194 laws affecting civil society, of which 65% were restrictive. In other countries, the threats are often against the integrity, lives, or security of organizations, defenders, their colleagues, and even their families. Civil society organizers and human rights defenders have been defamed as terrorists and traitors, subjected to judicial harassment, or falsely imprisoned, or become the victims of physical threats, reprisals, and assassinations. Speaking personally, far too many of the human rights defenders and activists I've had the honor and privilege to know over the years have been murdered. Very brave people, like the Salvadoran Jesuit priests, Ignacio Ellacuría, Segundo Montes, and Ignacio Martin Baró, a Russian democracy advocate, Boris Nemtsov, and Honduran land activist and indigenous leader, Berta Cáceres. Most of the time, those responsible for their deaths benefit from entrenched impunity. Even as we meet today, thousands of human rights defenders and civil society leaders bravely carry out their daily work under the threat of death. The Obama administration recognized the global crackdown on civil society and took some measures to combat it, such as the Stand With Civil Society initiative, a global call to action to support, defend, and sustain civil society groups worldwide. It made a point of working with and consulting civil society groups and opposed undue restrictions on civil society and fundamental freedoms. Whatever the criticisms of these efforts, and there were certainly criticisms, they reflected the long-standing U.S. belief that supporting civil society also supports and advances human rights and democracy. So I'm hopeful that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will also stand with civil society and continue this initiative. And while we have yet to hear the Trump administration's proposals in this area, and the budget announced last week, in my opinion, is not particularly encouraging. I'm hopeful that this initiative will continue to receive bipartisan support here in Congress. So this hearing is very timely and shining light on why Congress and the new administration should continue to support and advocate for a strong and healthy civil society in every nation. Today we'll hear from a number of experts about the causes and consequences of serious threats confronting civil society around the world. I look forward to hearing their recommendations and their suggestions on what actions the U.S. Congress should take that might help advance civil society, and those that might contribute to reversing some of the trends adversely affecting civil society globally and in particular countries. And before we go to our first witness, I'm happy to yield to my distinguished co-chair, Congressman Hultgren, for any opening statements.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. Thank you all for being here today for a very important hearing, and I want to thank you for your work. Good afternoon, and it is so important for us to be meeting together today on this subject. Throughout the history of the United States, civil society organizations have raised a crucial voice on behalf of our country. They've often challenged and encouraged the government to wisely steward its responsibility. At its best, the space of civil society facilitates a complex marketplace of ideas where people are strengthened by their differences and encouraged by how much they have in common. A healthy and thriving government protects this space, knowing that basic human rights such as freedom of speech, association, and religion are the building blocks of democracy. In recent years, it's been widely reported that many governments around the world are taking steps to close off the space in which civil society organizations operate. The aim of much of this legislation is to force organizations to gain government permission for their work and for their funding. This is particularly applied to organizations working on behalf of human rights and to those who have spoken against government violations of basic rights. As just a few examples, Cambodia passed a law in 2015 giving the government broad powers to close and prosecute NGOs and criticize its policies. Egypt's parliament approved a law in November 2016 giving the government broad discretion to deny the registration of civil society organizations. The closing of civil society space decreases government accountability and infringes on the rights of ordinary citizens. We have a very distinguished panel with us today, and I look forward to hearing how the United States policy may better address the threats that civil society is facing in many nations around the world. Thank you. Good to be with you, Co-Chairman. And again, I want to thank our presenters today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And our first panelist is Mina Kia. And I'm pronouncing that. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Kiai. Okay. Mina Kiai is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Among his many accomplishments, Mr. Kiai served as chairman of Kenya's National Human Rights Commission from 2003 to 2008. He was also the executive director of the International Council on Human Rights Policy, director of Amnesty International's Africa program, and Africa director of the International Human Rights Law Group. And so I think that's the signs that there's votes, but why don't we begin, and then we will take a break after you give your opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Honorable Co-Chairs, and thank you for your opening statements, which are very useful and very pertinent at this point. And thank you for inviting me to address this body on the subject of closing space for civil society. In other words, the increasingly restrictive and hostile environment that civil society faces throughout the world. I have served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association since May 2011, with a mandate to examine, monitor, and publicly report on these rights across the world. I have been reflecting a great deal on how much the world has changed since the UN Human Rights Council created my mandate in October 2010, a mandate that was sponsored by the United States. Back then, the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association were sometimes overlooked in the pantheon of rights, and the phrase closing space for civil society was way less common. Since then, however, these rights have underpinned some of the most momentous political events of the 21st century. The Arab awakenings in the Middle East and North Africa, mass protests that forced out leaders in Ukraine, Guatemala, Iceland, South Korea, Burkina Faso, and Brazil, citizens' movements in Hong Kong, Ethiopia, Bahrain, Malaysia, and the United States, and so much more. We have seen quite dramatically the power that civil society can wield in peacefully progressing democratic values and the aspirations of ordinary people. Unfortunately, over the same period, we have also seen the most comprehensive rollback of civic freedom since the end of the Cold War, including anti-NGO laws, restrictions on protests, increased militarization of police around policing of protests, crackdowns on trade unions, and campaigns of violence and intimidation against civil society leaders. We have also seen the rise of politicians coming to power on the back of promises to restrict fundamental rights, such as Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Sadly, these new tactics of repression and control have gone hand in hand with some of the old tactics. We remember and honor Berta Cáceres, the founder of the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations in Honduras, who was killed almost exactly a year ago. These two trends may seem paradoxical, but they are, in fact, inextricably linked. It is precisely because civil society can be so powerful, persuasive, and persistent that governments are moving to restrict it. And it is precisely because civil society has been so successful in motivating change that those with power, including powerful business interests, are fighting back. And that fight back has been vicious. I could spend the rest of the afternoon recounting hundreds of examples of just how difficult the environment is right now for civil society actors of all sorts in every corner of the globe. There is the brutal suppression of demonstrators that has been taking place in Ethiopia since late 2015, with hundreds killed by the government and no officials held to account. And in Kenya, the excuse of counterterrorism has been used to try to silence critical NGOs whose work, ironically, reduces the scope for violent extremism by exposing corrupt, extortionist security forces. In Cambodia, government leaders are rewriting laws to suppress independent NGOs and trade unions, jailing activists for exercising their fundamental rights, and using violence and a corrupt judiciary to undermine any political opposition, mainly to shield themselves from accountability for mass corruption. Similar efforts are ongoing in Malaysia, where the regime is targeting all critical sectors to avoid accountability for the massive corruption around the 1MDB organization, some of whose proceeds have been invested here in the USA. There is Bahrain and its thousands of political prisoners, including people like Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja and my friend Abdul Jalil al-Singase, who will spend the rest of their lives in prison for leading peaceful pro-democracy protests. It is the same story in Azerbaijan, where the authorities have put in place legislation allowing the state to fully control civil society and justify the arbitrary detention of critical human rights defenders, journalists, and activists. And in Rwanda, economic progress is hailed even when it comes at the expense of closed space for civil society and no tolerance for public dissent. I could give many more examples, including from the UK, France, Russia, and Kazakhstan. But the point today is not to highlight specific trees. It is to show the forest and to underscore that this forest is quite literally on fire. Indeed, as my term as Special Rapporteur comes to a close, one thing is increasingly clear to me. We're in the midst of an epic global struggle, and it's not just about civil society space, assembly rights, or any other human rights in isolation. It's about our freedom writ large. A global clash between tyranny and intolerance on the one hand, and self-determination and dignity on the other, that could shape the course of our world for generations to come. This struggle is for the future of equality, humanity, and democratic values. It could also be a fight for our very existence, given the slew of serious and intractable problems our world faces today. Brutal wars, rampant corruption, devastating environmental destruction, growing poverty amidst dangerous inequality and a shrinking middle class, violent extremism, and rising intolerance of the other, just to name a few. It is in everyone's interest to give people tools to fight these forest fires and to do it peacefully so that we can reconfigure our world into something more sustainable, equitable, and just. It is a time when assembly and association rights are needed most, so people can peacefully speak out, contribute their talents, and share their ideas. If we don't give people these tools, our world faces a dark future. If there's one thing I've learned in my years defending human rights, it is that people who have no means to engage in a society also have no stake in protecting it, let alone defending it. Inevitably, some will feel emboldened to destroy it because it no longer includes them. The destruction may not come tomorrow, next week, or even next year, but eventually things will explode. The struggle we face today is about creating a world where people have a stake. The road to achieving this world will not be easy. And let me conclude by emphasizing that it will be harder to achieve without the United States fulfilling its role as a global leader on human rights. The United States, which graciously hosted me on an official visit last summer, needs to set an example by promoting and protecting the fundamental rights of its citizens and the people on its soil. It starts with the United States accepting that trade unions, with their right to strike and collective bargaining, are a crucial part of democratic values and for reducing inequality and frustrations. People should be robustly encouraged to form unions as a counterweight to the enormous and unfettered power of businesses, which leads to inequality. It starts with the United States doing more to deracialize the criminal justice system so that black people feel that their lives matter. It starts with the United States embracing the power of freedom of peaceful assembly instead of allowing discourses and legal efforts to violate and undermine it. And it starts with the United States leading the fight against misogyny, intolerance, and bigotry, both for all the people in its territory, but also as an integral part of its foreign policy and international relations. This means that the United States should continue to play an active and hopefully positive role in multilateral bodies such as the United Nations. It means not playing favorites when it comes to human rights abroad and recognizing that security, trade, and human rights are indivisibly linked. There can be no peace without justice. There is no stability without freedom. If ever there was a time for the U.S. Congress to assert its leadership both here and abroad, it is now. Many generations past across the world have looked to the U.S. and the U.S. Congress as the beacon of hope and support for progressive values. And at a time when democratic values are in recession across the globe, this body is more necessary than ever. This is not a time for empty words, trite slogans, and doublespeak. The stakes are too high for the United States and for all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for your excellent testimony. As you said, we have votes. We're going to break here. But let me make a suggestion while we're gone. There's some chairs here. People should sit down. You're making me nervous standing up. So if we could reconfigure this so everybody could sit down, that'd be better. So anyway, we'll be back shortly. Thanks. Where's the question? Here we go. All right. All right, I ran over here so quickly, I need to catch my breath. Thank you so much for waiting, and thank you for your patience, and thank you for your excellent testimony. And maybe we could begin with, if you could give us your perspective. What are the main causes of these threats to civil society? I mean, the threats to civil society appear to be a global phenomenon. Is it possible to generalize about causality, or is each individual country case unique? Are there regional factors at play? What order of importance do you attribute to different causes giving rise to threats to civil society? Are there some that are more important than others? Do different causes point to different policy responses? Just give you it's a short question.
Thank you, Congressman, for that. I think of course, you cannot generalize the causes across the world. I think they're all different. But in general terms, I think the big part of the causes, I think, is a recession, is a democratic recession, and an antipathy towards dissent. So whether the dissent is coming from environmental groups who want to continue who are opposed to the environmental projects, and then that ties in with the state, but generally it's a sense of intolerance that's going on across the world. People and governments and people in authority and those with power, and I want to emphasize here that also includes businesses that have become really powerful and are working in cahoots with states often. In fact, the trend now is that not only are business people influencing governments, they're now taking over governments in many parts of the world, and I think that's changing a lot of the dynamics around that. So you see that there's a lot, I call it fundamentalism, and whether it's market fundamentalism or it's religious fundamentalism, because that's another part of it. So it's state and non-state actors. It's also political fundamentalism, where governments like China believe that no one but the Communist Party has anything to offer, or it's nationalistic fundamentalism, as in Russia, where there's basically one viewpoint that's only allowed. So dissent is a big part of it. So when we look at it, it's not just about civil society. In fact, the issue is really closing space for dissent. Mm-hmm. So that includes independent media, whether they are for profit or non-profit. That's also affected. It's people opposed to big projects around. Sometimes it's people trying to form trade unions in certain countries because there is a sense of opposition to it. It's people in Ethiopia who are trying just basically to do women's rights issues and across the world. So that's where it starts from. And I think the cause, as I mentioned in my testimony, is I think states understanding that civil society can be powerful without it being necessarily partisanly political and looking for votes. I think that's where it starts from.
I also worry too that that countries are more and more using fear as a tactic to close down political spaces. We're doing this to protect the greater good. We can't have opposition newspapers because they'll give comfort to our supposed enemies, or we can't have different voices or different groups be recognized because that makes things complicated. But I don't know if this is, I suppose it's always been this way, but it seems to me that fear is being used more and more and more by countries around the world to basically shut down any kind of dissent.
Indeed, sir.
I'm thinking of the Philippines too, with the terrible atrocities going on there, and and this guy gets up and basically says he's fighting terrorism when he's killing innocent people every day.
Indeed, I think fear globally, and as you said, is not a new phenomenon. I think if you go back to the Cold War, it was a big factor to stop dissent. The trends now is that many states are using terrorism as the excuse, or they're using the drug war in Philippines, or they're using the need for national unity in different countries, or they're using a sense that we have to decide ourselves. But what I find fascinating, for example, let me use the example of Ethiopia, is that groups that are working on governance issues, women's rights, election, anti-corruption, human rights, are mandated to receive only 10% of foreign funding. That's all they are allowed. Yet this is a government that receives 65% of its budget from foreign sources. And it just doesn't make, so it seems to say that if the money comes to government, it's fine. If it goes to civil society, it's not fine. So I think this kind of issue is one that needs further exploration and further interrogation, I think, by the United States and by the Congress to figure out how does the Ethiopian government justify this, because it also does. I mean, some of those resources are being used on these same issues on women's rights by the government, is being used on election issues by the government. So why it is all right for foreigners to fund government but not fund civil society is incredible. I think it's one of the hypocrisies of our time.
You know, I've over the years been involved in efforts to try to condition aid to certain countries based on human rights progress, or cut aid if there's a lack of progress in human rights. Unfortunately, there's always a waiver that's put in there that oftentimes is utilized by the administration, which kind of takes the teeth out of what the message we're trying to get across. But one of the things I fear, and I appreciate your comments on this, is that governments that I think have long been counted on to advocate for human rights are now more and more advocating policies that put human rights on the back burner for the sake of economic interests, military strategic interests. If we have a military, I'll give you an example, Bahrain. You know, we are deeply concerned about the eroding situation in Bahrain, and you know, and this goes back to the previous administration. We were very critical of them for not being tougher on the government of Bahrain. That was jailing doctors. That was people who treated protesters, as well as anybody who had a different point of view. But in conversations, it always came back to the strategic interest here, and how it fits into our geopolitical, view of the world. And Iran might be a threat, and we need to have Bahrain. And so, therefore, I think there was a little bit of a soft pedaling when it came to human rights. And I worry that that's becoming the trend with China. I mean, our economic ties are very, very, substantial, and it's, and every once in a while we'll get a statement out of an administration that will highlight a human rights problem or challenge, but when it comes to Tibet, for example, other than kind of talking the talk, we don't walk the walk. I mean, there's no consequence for China's policy in Tibet. There's no consequence for China's policy on the Uyghurs. There's no consequence for China's cracking down on human rights defenders in Beijing or in Hong Kong. Russia, the same thing. That's why we passed this Magnitsky Act. And now the Global Magnitsky Act was to basically say, even if there's not a consequence in the particular country for a human rights abuser, there will be a consequence here. You can't come here. You can't hide your money in our banks. But I worry that we're getting to the point where people are resigned to the fact that human rights has to take be on the back burner because these other issues are more and more important.
Yeah, I think, and you've mentioned something really important. I think the fact is that historically, human rights has never been really the core principle or the core issue in many countries' foreign policy, and that's one of the saddest things around it all. And I think that it's getting less and less important as the world changes in the way we are seeing. And I think the call is to say that, yes, I think anybody in human rights who works in human rights will accept that human rights is not the only concern that any country should have. There are other concerns, there's trade, there's security, and other things that are important. But when human rights is constantly being put on the back burner, is being treated as a stepchild, it does affect every other relationship in the world. And I think what you say is important. And I want to say something as well, because I think this is important for those of us who are not American, who have been involved in this work, is one of the U.S.'s strengths has been as a moral power, the soft power of the U.S. in speaking out, in raising issues, in protecting individuals, in protecting aspects of it. I think that's something you don't want to lose. And I think that it's something where you want to see that U.S. role playing out, even though sometimes U.S. has played a negative role on human rights and other issues. But you want to maintain the fact that it's done on the positive side. I think for us, the issue is to encourage the U.S. to keep on doing the positive things it has done historically. And I think that's the important part. But I also want to say that it seems to me some of the issues that are rather simple that we can all agree on, like trade union rights, where I don't think anybody in the world should think that trade unions are bad, because I think you cannot. There's no other way you can ever build up equality and build a middle class without strong trade unions. I think that's somewhere the U.S. needs to provide leadership in its both internationally but also domestically in terms of encouraging trade unions. When I was here, it surprised me that there's sometimes people think that the government should be neutral around trade union rights. But I think the framing of international human rights law and the understanding is that actually there is a positive duty by states, by the government, to promote trade union rights and people to associate for their own betterment, to increase their capacity to bargain better and the right to strike. So I think it's important to say that. And some of these things don't cost money. They cost. It doesn't cost money, but I think it's important to keep the United States as some sort of a beacon. It's a tough world out there, and I think as we're all seeing and all trying to make sense of what's going on in the world in different countries, as the rise of the various forms of intolerance increase, I think we are all asking ourselves where will the U.S. Congress play out on this, and whether the U.S. Congress will remain that conscious of the administration, but also the conscience of many people in the world, and keep playing the role and pushing for these rights to happen. Because there's no way that you can have a democracy without civil society, whichever way you cut it. So any country that says it is a democracy but does not encourage a broad civil society, the content almost doesn't matter. It really is that the people have the chance to associate and assemble, chance to protest, the chance to express themselves. Without that, you cannot have a democracy, and you can't even have proper development. And the mythology that keeps coming up in many places, that the Beijing model of development is what's good, where you forget about rights and just make sure that economic growth happens, is the best way. I think has been shaken by Tunisia in 2011, because Tunisia had ticked all the boxes of the Millennium Development Goals, had achieved everything, but it hadn't done enough on the freedom aspect, on the sense of people feeling that they have stakes in the country. So when Mohamed Bouazizi killed himself, then just led to all this outpouring, and Tunisia is no longer has no longer achieved those indicators had there. So I think for me the big thing is that development also happens best when people are also given the chance to speak, when freedom goes hand in hand with development. And it's easy to think the Beijing model is the best way to go and shut everybody out, and because that's not sustainable. It's really top down, and it's very shaky. It can be shaken so fast and so easily that you lose out at the end of the day.
No, I agree with you, and I think that also that speaking for the United States, I mean, I think it's in our interest to support civil society around the world and to promote human rights, because usually when the human rights situation is bad, countries are there's a lot of instability, and oftentimes in terms of development for those countries, who wants to? Not a lot of people want to invest in resources in countries like that. Let me just say one final thing, because you are the UN Special Rapporteur. So I think it's important. Before I get to that, I just want to say, one of the you talk about U.S. Congress. One of the unique things about this commission, and if my colleague Congressman Hultgren were here, I would say this, that the people on this commission actually believe that human rights ought to be a major part of our foreign policy. We ought to be upfront, out loud, foursquare for human rights. And this is this is a rarity on Capitol Hill, where there is this bipartisan consensus, and we come and we meet on all kinds of issues impacting people all over the world. And it was out of this commission that the Magnitsky Act came about, and on a whole series of human rights legislation. This commission has been in the forefront, either in kind of developing it or pushing for it. So, doesn't matter who's in the White House, Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter who's in control of Congress. I think the people on this commission here are all of like mind. So, just as a little bit of reassurance. But since you, I want to just give you a little an opportunity here to basically put on record what is the value of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions in pushing back against the closing of space for civil society. You know, in other words, why is UN action important? I think it's sometimes people question whether the UN is effective. I want to give you an opportunity to tell us why it is.
I think, and thank you for that question. I think the UN is crucial when talking about human rights across the world, because it's a universe, it's a global body. It's not one country, it's not one country's foreign interests, it's not one country's strategic interests. It's the world saying we care about human rights. And to that extent, it has been quite useful and quite effective. I know the what they call the special procedure system of the United Nations as special rapporteur, and I can tell you that I think there are few mechanisms that exist globally that are as effective and as useful to human rights as these mechanisms. In the work I've done for the last 6 years, going to many countries across the world, the kind of hope that this brings to people, because I go and speak as a UN Special Rapporteur, has been amazing. It has actually been way beyond my expectations when I started. I didn't think it would be that important and that useful to people in terms of giving hope and in motivating civil society, in motivating activists and human rights defenders. I think the U.S. engagement has been useful, to be honest. I think that especially the last 6 years of since I've been in this term, the U.S. pushed and sponsored this mandate. The U.S. has been an ally in many ways in working through some of the harder countries and pushing some of the harder resolutions. I think the involvement has been a positive involvement. And I think anybody who has hung around the halls of UN human rights system in Geneva will tell you the U.S. has been an active and positive player the last few months. It's important that is built on rather than destroyed. And I think it's important that this bipartisan approach continues in terms of the UN in Geneva and the Office of High Commissioner. I want to say that I think the world is lucky right now because the High Commissioner for Human Rights is absolutely brilliant and wonderful and very clear about human rights in a very non-partisan, clear, unambiguous way. It's a good moment. He's able to criticize Russia and the US at the same time, Europe and Africa at the same time, Asia, and be able to also push forward a global standard. That's what we need. So I think what the UN does bring is a global standard for these values, and that's important. That you don't have people feeling that this is the US pushing this, or this is Russia pushing this, or China pushing that, or India pushing that, or Venezuela pushing something. It's seen as a global approach, and that's very, very useful because it makes it clear that across the world we all are deserving of these rights, no matter where we are born or no matter where we have the fortune or misfortune of being born in whichever country. We all have these rights, and these rights stay with us these rights stay with us even when we cross borders. Mm-hmm. The rights do not depend upon a country. They depend upon the fact that you're an individual, you're a human being in a global world, and these rights go with me wherever I go. So I think that's an important part of the UN system. I think that would be useful that the US Congress, even as the budget is coming through, does maintain some of this support for human rights within the budget for the UN human rights system, and especially the special procedures part.
Well, I appreciate very much your words of advice, and I appreciate all the work that you've done in service to human rights. We are very grateful, and I wish we had a lot longer to have this conversation, but I have to go to another panel, and then they're going to throw us out of the room. So, but I do want to tell you how much we appreciate you being here, and how much we appreciate your service, and I hope that you'll stay in touch with us, and any suggestions along the way, and any advice would be most welcome. But I again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
So we'll call up now the second panel. First, Vanessa L. Tucker, the Vice President for Analysis at Freedom House, where her area of focus is the Middle East. She previously served as the Project Director of Countries at the Crossroads, Freedom House's annual survey of democratic governance in 70 strategically important countries around the world. Margaret Wang, Pronouncing that properly? Yeah, good. I usually screw everything up. Is the Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. She has previously worked as Executive Director of the Rights Working Group, Director of the U.S. Program at Global Rights as Program Director at the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, as Program Manager at the Asia Foundation, and as Committee Staff for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Doug Rutson is President and CEO of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which works with governments, legislators, and civil society to develop the legal framework for civil society and philanthropy in over 100 countries. Under Doug's leadership, ICNL received the MacArthur Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. Among other activities, Doug serves as the Federal Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid and co-chairs the civil society pillar of the Community of Democracies. Dr. Maria J. Stefan is a Senior Policy Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Previously, she worked as non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and as lead foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Working on both the Afghanistan and Syria engagements, Stefan has written or edited numerous works on nonviolent civil resistance, democracy, and governance. Thank you all. Did I mispronounce anybody's name? Stefan, right? All right, I want to get it right because we're on camera. Anyway, Ms. Tucker, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you. Chairman McGovern and Chairman Holtgren and members of the Commission, it is an honor to testify before you today. I ask that my full written testimony be admitted to the record.
Without objection.
Freedom House's flagship publication, Freedom in the World, has documented political rights and civil liberties in every single country in the world for more than 40 years. Our most recent edition marked the 11th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. This is the longest running slump that we've ever measured. After a long-running trend of authoritarian governments getting worse, 2016 saw a number of setbacks in countries widely considered to be established democracies, among them Brazil, the Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Poland, Serbia, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, and Tunisia. Our analysis shows that the ability of civil society institutions to function without state restrictions has suffered a pronounced decline over this period. It is in particular the organizations that pursue politically sensitive topics, human rights advocacy, democratic reform, and anti-corruption measures among them, that are under threat. The setbacks have been concentrated in states like Russia, China, Venezuela, and Iran, but civil society has also met growing problems in democracies, India and Indonesia among them, and in settings where democracy's prospects are unclear, including Ecuador, Hungary, Bolivia, and Kenya. Especially in countries where elections have been rendered meaningless, civil society groups can be surrogates for democratic opposition and are therefore regarded with deep suspicion by the leadership. The growing offensive against civil society is in many ways a tribute to the prominent role that these organizations play in the political life of most countries. An active civil society is often seen as a formidable threat to repressive or the illiberal status quo. Civil society was the linchpin in the successful popular revolutions in Serbia, Ukraine, Tunisia, and Georgia. In fact, civil society organizations frequently pose a greater threat to autocracy than do traditional opposition parties, which have proven relatively easy for determined authoritarians to sideline, neutralize, or co-opt. Civil society movements, by contrast, are generally composed of younger activists committed to a cause who are more resilient, more agile, and less prone to corruption. These factors make civil society the central avenue for political participation in many countries and therefore a prime target for an assault on democratic rights. Governments employ myriad legal and strong-arm strategies to restrict civil society, but I would like to draw attention to a theme that runs through all of these tactics. The vilification of civil society as illegitimate and foreign. These groups are often portrayed as venal, paid agents of nebulous transnational forces dedicated to diluting national sovereignty. This phenomenon has surfaced across Europe, particularly with the advent of the migrant crisis. The common theme is that pro-democracy civil society groups that stand up to populists and nationalists, defend the rights of minorities and refugees, and work with institutions like the European Union are alien to an authentic nation. Civil society groups work to solve some of the most difficult political questions their countries have ever faced and are ridiculed as foreign agents, left vulnerable to attack by the increasing numbers of radical nationalist forces. It is an immediate threat to human rights democracy when this kind of political activity is presented as a foreign imposition rather than a basic political participation based on fundamental democratic principles. Freedom House recommends 3 measures to stop this troubling trend. First, there are many leaders around the world who see the current political climate in the United States as vindication of their engagement with extremist and populist rhetoric. Congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle should condemn attacks on and put a public ridicule of civil society in the United States and anywhere else in the world in order to make it clear that they do not endorse an approach to politics that treats civil society groups as enemies of the nation. When mainstream politicians flirt with extremist rhetoric, it normalizes that behavior and opens the door to groups and individuals that will act, whether through speech or through physical violence. Secondly, the U.S. should prioritize diplomatic and financial support for civil society organizations around the world. This is a matter not just of doing what is right, but is also a strategic imperative. Pluralist societies have more mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution and are therefore more stable international partners. Strong and diverse civil society is an excellent foundation for political pluralism. Finally, this support should include the return of USAID to Central and Eastern Europe to provide sustained support to civil society groups. It is clear from our analysis over the last few years that the deterioration in Hungary over recent years is just the beginning, and a process of de-democratization is underway in some important areas of the region. Both Hungary and Poland are currently considering legislation to restrict civil society organizations. The United States must make clear, even before such legislation is considered by legislative bodies, that we consider such measures an assault on democracy. It is not in the American interest to let this decline grow worse, and it would only be an unfortunate development for the region and would send a terrible message to emerging democracies around the world. Despite these disturbing trends that I have outlined, there remains a great deal of democratic activism by civil society groups around the world. In the face of increasing threats and violence from governments and nationalist groups, civil society organizations continue to do the difficult work of promoting democratic change. These groups are on the front lines of the defense for democratic liberties, and they deserve our support and admiration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Huang, the Executive Director for Amnesty International USA. I'd like to thank the Lantos Human Rights Commission, of course, Chairman McGovern and Chairman Holgren, for this important hearing and for inviting Amnesty USA to participate today. I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the critical work of the Lantos Commission in highlighting human rights as a priority for the U.S. Congress. Your work has helped to free prisoners of conscience around the world, including Dr. Ton Aung in Myanmar, school teacher Suni Sori in India, and human rights defender Nguyen Thien Truong in Vietnam. You've helped to change lives, and we're grateful. But we have a lot of work to do moving forward. As other panelists have noted, human rights defenders, people who take nonviolent action on behalf of human rights, are under grave threat around the world, and we are actually in a moment of crisis. Today, almost 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and 20 years after the adoption of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, the space in which human rights defenders work is shrinking, and defenders themselves are being targeted, attacked, imprisoned, and killed. Governments, armed groups, companies, and others in power are taking a range of measures to silence criticism and to stop the work of defenders. As those in power seek to protect their interests, they portray those who challenge them as foreign agents, as terrorists, or as threats to development, thereby creating divisions in communities. This paves the way for them to attack defenders, ruin reputations, unjustly imprison people, and to use violence. Governments are legislating to restrict the peaceful exercise of human rights, placing obstacles in the ways of defenders' work and putting them at greater risk. Such laws ban access to foreign funding for civil society organizations or place hurdles in the way of registration. They authorize the use of excessive force or punitive charges against peaceful protesters, or they allow for mass surveillance. Day by day, the space in which civil society operates is shrinking more. Hate speech and the casting of collective blame onto minority groups for real or perceived social ills or economic hardship is on the rise and is creating an environment of hostility. The persistent disregard for international law and standards is also creating an unstable and dangerous environment for defenders. Defenders often lack access to information, networks, and tools that they need to bring about change and to keep themselves safe. Many countries lack the laws and programs to support their work or protect them from attacks. Those who attack them are rarely brought to justice. Defenders in all regions and from every walk of life are risking everything to end injustice. So we must support them and see ourselves as human rights defenders, recognizing our responsibility to protect the rights of all people. In light of this, Amnesty International is launching a global campaign this year to protect human rights defenders around the world. And we will be covering a range of themes, including killings of defenders, surveillance, the use of laws to shrink the space for civil society, and the important role of women human rights defenders. In the rest of my remarks, I'd like to focus on the grave problem of killings and attacks of defenders, particularly in the Americas region. We've submitted a copy of Amnesty International's annual report, which goes into much greater details about trends, concerns, and countries around the world, which I hope will be submitted for the record. Amnesty International has documented the physical attacks, killings, and enforced disappearances of defenders across all regions of the world, and rarely a day goes by without reports of physical attacks against defenders and sometimes their families. These actions, whether committed by state or non-state actors, are a direct attempt to stop the human rights activities carried out by defenders, and they send a chilling message to others in the community that they should refrain from defending human rights. In the Americas region in 2016, defending human rights remained extremely dangerous. Defenders have been targeted with threats, attacks, torture, and enforced appearances, and some have been killed by state and non-state actors as a way to silence them. Defenders also face smear campaigns and vilification, yet there has been very little progress in investigating these attacks or bringing perpetrators to justice. Human rights defenders and social movements opposing large-scale development projects and transnational corporations were at particular risk of reprisals. Women and indigenous human rights defenders, as well as those from other communities historically excluded, were also targeted with violence. Honduras and Guatemala were the most dangerous countries in the world in 2016 for those defending land, territory, and the environment, with a wave of threats, trumped-up charges, smear campaigns, attacks, and killings of prominent environmental and land activists. You've already highlighted the death of Berta Cáceres in March of 2016. In Colombia, we've documented a significant increase in the number of killings of human rights defenders since the peace accords have been signed. And this is something, Chairman McGovern, that we've been very grateful to you for your leadership in addressing those. In Peru, Maxima Acuna, a peasant farmer in a legal battle with Yanacocha, one of the biggest gold and copper mines in the region, has faced a campaign of harassment and intimidation in which security personnel have allegedly physically attacked her and her family. In Cuba, despite claims of more political openness and the reestablishment of relations with the USA, civil society and opposition groups have reported increased harassment of government critics. Human rights defenders and political activists have been publicly described as subversive and as anti-Cuban mercenaries. Some have been subjected to short-term arbitrary detention before being released without charge, often several times a month. And here in the United States, Amnesty International is seriously concerned about allegations of excessive militarized force against indigenous water protectors and their allies at Standing Rock, as well as the recent rash of state laws introduced this year in 20 states across the country that could undermine the right to peaceful protest. In closing, we have much work to do to support civil society and the critical activism of human rights defenders around the world. We're grateful to have the partnership of the Lantos Commission in this effort. And we would encourage you to undertake the following recommendations. First, continue to take action for specific prisoner of conscience and human rights defenders cases through the Defending Freedoms Project, and encourage your colleagues in Congress to do the same. Second, call for the investigation and prosecution of threats and killings against human rights defenders, and recognize their importance in the role that they play in society. Third, continue to take the lead on Dear Colleague letters, supporting resolutions, and passing legislation that will protect human rights defenders around the world. Fourth, vote to protect and to increase U.S. government funding used by the Department of State, the United Nations, and other institutions to help free prisoners of conscience and support human rights defenders. And fifth, please stand against any U.S. federal or state legislation or policy that would undermine the right to peaceful protest, expression, or assembly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, and I express my appreciation to you and to Mr. Holcomb for your leadership on human rights issues. In the early 1990s, I was the legal advisor to the Czechoslovak Parliament when it was still Czechoslovakia, and my first job was to write the nonprofit laws of the country. I was working with a nuclear physicist turned dissident. Our motto at the time was "Všechno je možné," anything is possible. And so it seemed. We were riding this wave of democratization. Civil society was associated with the people power movement in the Philippines, with the political changes in Chile, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. But we forgot something that every beachgoer knows. Waves eventually break, and then they recede. And over time, what we've seen is the recession of democracy and human rights. And civil society is caught in a cross-current of constraint. First, the data. In the last 5 years, 70 countries have enacted restrictions on civil society around the world. Disaggregating the data, 45% of the restrictions seek to inhibit the ability of citizens to form or operate a civil society organization or CSO. A third of the restrictions impede the ability of organizations to receive funding from the United States or any other source, and the remainder seek to target freedom of assembly and social movements. And we're not talking about modest constraints. We're looking at the situation where governments think they have the right to interfere and intervene in the private decisions of citizens on how they want to make the world a better place. Consider Bahrain, where under the law of Bahrain, if a citizen wants to establish an association, the government has the right to decide whether or not society needs the organization. Or consider Russia, where under the law in Russia, if a group receives international funding and also seeks to engage in political activities, they have to self-declare themselves a foreign agent. It's roughly modeled on a 1938 law here in the United States, but things got lost in translation. The word foreign agent in Russian is the same as the word for foreign spy. But it's not all bad news. Kyrgyzstan, for example, was considering a Russian-inspired foreign agents law. And thanks to USAID's support, our Kyrgyz partners were able to meet with members of the parliament, talking to them about why the law would undermine Kyrgyz stability and national interests. So before the final vote in parliament, the government and the parliament decided that the law would not proceed, and they voted down the law in parliament. And civil society isn't just playing defense. Legislation is loosening restrictions on civil society in countries as diverse as Afghanistan, Bulgaria, Honduras, Iraq, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Tunisia. No law is perfect, but democracy is a process, and the enactment of these laws is a step forward. Of course, the primary credit for the success belongs to the remarkable women and men on the front lines in this contest over civic space. At the same time, the international community can and does play an important role helping to develop the expertise of local civil society, legislators, and government officials. The pioneer in this field was USAID. They recognized that civic space wasn't about the passage of a particular law. It isn't a transactional challenge. Rather, it's a transformational challenge, requiring an investment in people and in institutions. And we find this approach applied by other strategic partners, including the government of Sweden, the Mott Foundation, and the State Department. And we see the impact. Restrictive laws have been prevented, progressive laws have been enacted, and tens of thousands of organizations have room to operate because of these strategic investments. So as we heard, it's a pivotal moment. What can Congress do? A couple of concrete recommendations. First, funding. If the foreign assistance budget is slashed, the administration will need to find areas to cut. Civil society legal reform projects don't cost a lot. The median country engagement is $25,000 to $50,000. But I'm not sure this administration will prioritize funding for civil society, democracy, and human rights. So if you care about the issues we've been discussing today, we need your help in the appropriations process. 2, please continue to include legislation and language in laws and resolutions supporting independent civil society. An example is the Brownback Amendment, which states that democracy and governance shall not be subject to prior approval by foreign governments. 3, Congress should conduct oversight of federal agencies and departments to determine the extent to which they support or undermine civil society and human rights. Congress might also conduct fact-finding to see how the administration balances human rights, national security, and defense in particular countries. 4, Congress should exercise oversight to ensure the administration continues to work multilaterally on these issues of civic space, including through the Community of Democracies, the United Nations, including the Human Rights Council and the UN Democracy Fund. Finally, the world is watching. The world is watching how we deal with dissent, peaceful protests, and nonprofits. It's therefore critically important that we lead by example, safeguarding civil society both internationally and here at home. Thank you.
Co-Chairman McGovern and Hultgren and members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, thank you very much for organizing today's important hearing on global threats to civil society. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this commission, although I should say at the outset that the views I'm expressing today are my own and not those necessarily of the United States Institute of Peace. Good, in agreement. The powerful story that we've heard today is that government crackdowns against civil society are weakening human rights globally and making the world less safe. When governments shut down space for independent civil society, they are excluding key groups, undermining their legitimacy, and making recourse to violence and terrorism more likely. Civil society is being targeted in part because of the effectiveness of organized citizen action in opening political spaces, challenging authoritarian tyranny, and building democracy. A study that I co-conducted a few years ago examined 323 major violent and nonviolent campaigns over the past century, and we asked how often these campaigns have succeeded and why. Our study found that not only have nonviolent campaigns been twice as effective as armed struggles in achieving major political goals, but they are also strongly correlated with democratic consolidation and civil peace. A strong U.S. government response to closing civic space should engage the wider defense, diplomacy, and development communities focused on the challenges of state fragility, resurgent authoritarianism, and violent extremism, all problems exacerbated by government's systematic violations of human rights and their suffocation of civil society. Let me propose a few concrete recommendations to strengthen the USG approach. First, Congress should back the establishment of closing spaces task forces at the State Department, USAID, and DoD in order to ensure information exchange, policy, and programmatic coordination. These task forces should work with members of Congress to identify priority countries where the security risks associated with closing civic space are high and develop country-specific, multi-year strategies to enable long-term support for civil society and government engagement. Second, Congress should help ensure that DoD is fully engaged in the fight to defend civic space. Presidential Policy Directive 23 on security cooperation provides the structure to do this. However, security assistance bifurcation within the U.S. government and the inability to transfer funds readily between departments makes it difficult to couple security assistance with efforts to strengthen governance in civil society. Congress should support expanded interagency transfer authorities between DoD, state, and USAID for joint programming. Third, and this reflects recommendations from other panelists today, in an era of global crackdowns against civil society, funding levels at state, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy focused on human rights, democracy, and governance should be robust. This is necessary to support research on effective responses and to help courageous civil society leaders effectively push back against government pushback. But how donors provide support and to whom really matters. A recent survey of over 1,100 civic leaders from 11 countries that are semi-closed and closed highlighted that civil society groups most benefit from donor funding that is multi-year and that supports their core operations. This type of support allows them to be strategic, flexible, and responsive to local constituencies, rather than shifting from project to project and following donor agendas. This entails pivoting from a project mindset to a movement mindset. Civil society funding should incentivize cross-issue, cross-sector coalitions involving development, humanitarian, and private sector actors, in addition to human rights and advocacy NGOs. Such coalitions have been particularly effective in pushing back against restrictive laws in places like Kenya and Cambodia. Emergency grants provided through the Lifeline Fund are critically important. So too are long-term efforts like the Civil Society Innovation Initiative, a public-private initiative co-sponsored by USAID, which has helped stand up 6 regional civil society innovation hubs around the world. State and aid should continue to invest in programs that support constructive engagement between governments and civil society in order to ease tensions, ensure accountability, and reduce the likelihood of government efforts to close civic space. For example, the USIP implemented Justice and Security Dialogue multi-year program in Nepal involving the police and local communities has demonstrably improved police community relations, increased respect for the rights of marginalized groups, and reduced violence. Fourth, members of Congress should exploit the bully pulpit to condemn restrictive NGO laws and other repressive actions targeting civil society. CODELs, meeting with foreign government and security officials, can emphasize that vibrant civil societies strengthen state sovereignty and promote greater economic prosperity. They can demonstrate their commitment to open civic space by meeting with diverse civil society actors, including grassroots organizers outside of capital cities. Fifth, the private sector should be actively engaged. Businesses have a financial interest in protecting civil societies that can hold governments accountable, expose corruption, and advance the rule of law. There are compelling examples from Angola, Pakistan, Cambodia, and Thailand where multinational firms have sided with civil society following government attacks on civil rights. Congress can encourage corporations to follow their values, leverage their networks, and mobilize collective action when governments crack down against civil society. Finally, the U.S. should continue to press this issue in multilateral forums. The globally endorsed UN Sustainable Development Goal process could encourage development, humanitarian, and human rights actors to jointly adopt benchmarks and indicators related to civic space and make defense of civil society space central to achieving all the SDGs. And I completely agree that the work of the UN Special Rapporteurs, including the Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association, should continue to receive strong US backing. In conclusion, global crackdowns against activists, human rights defenders, and wider civil society threaten core US values and interests. Congress has a critical role to play to ensure that tools and programs designed to address attacks on civil society are properly funded, that defense programs are properly aligned with this effort, and that the private sector is effectively engaged. They can send a clear message to governments and civil societies overseas that the American people will continue to defend basic rights and fundamental freedoms at home and around the world. Our security, in fact, depends upon it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank all of you. We have a short period of time before they're going to throw us out of the room, but I wanted to get your comments on a few issues, if I could. Let me just say at the outset, you know, I think a lot of us were jarred by the president's budget, and specifically some of the cuts in the State Department. But I think, and I'm hopeful that you know, that's not going to be the reality. You know, because I've talked to Hal Rogers, the chairman of the Foreign Ops Appropriations Committee. I think he also was a little bit jarred by that budget. I think there is a bipartisan group, well, I say consensus in hopefully the House and Senate that you know, diplomacy is important, that funding State Department functions are important, funding USAID is important, funding human rights work is important. So you know, we'll wait and see. But I'm not ready to jump out the window yet. And I think it's important that people like you, especially, are talking to members about the importance to make sure we have a robust budget for the State Department. How important that is for promoting civil society, especially in places where civil society is being, you know, is come under attack. But I don't know, as you know, I'm not quite sure what this administration's policies are going to be. But I'd be curious to get your opinion, you know, based on kind of past performance. I mean, for example, I mean, you know, do you think that our embassies are active enough in standing up when civil society is under attack in various countries around the world? I mean, is that? I mean, you know, I've always felt that our human rights officers could do more. They could be present at in more places. But I'd be curious if you were to give a grade to, you know, our people on the ground in these countries. How would you characterize it? Well, it's great down, yeah.
Thanks. I would say that the embassies are active, diplomats are engaged, but I would suggest that this is fundamentally a development issue, not a diplomatic issue. Once it reaches this stage of diplomatic engagement, it's much harder in our 30-year experience working on this to affect any change. That what we really need to do is invest in a deep development approach like we see, for example, with USAID, where you develop the capacity of local parliamentarians, civil society, and government officials so that they can own the process and sustain reform.
Sure, I would agree with that, and I recall one of my recommendations regarding USAID in Central and Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, the process of development of these political institutions is not necessarily one from which any country, including the United States, can graduate. It's not a process that you complete and move on to something else. And so it's particularly important to focus not just on building them in new democracies, but the important and ongoing work of funding, strengthening, and continuing to make sure that the foundation is solid over time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chairman. I think there's no question that the human rights reporting of the State Department has improved over the years. I think the quality of reporting can vary according to the officer who's responsible in each country. But I will note that having those discussions in country with civil society actors in those countries creates a space and an opportunity both for those activists as well as for the U.S. to learn from what's happening from people on the ground. So I think the process itself has proven to be really valuable. I just wanted to note one other comment to your point about the budget and the potential cuts that we're considering and hearing about. I think I recently had the opportunity to meet with Secretary General Guterres at the UN, and there's no question that there is widespread concern about the potential for U.S. budget cuts for the contribution to the UN system. Aside from losing the valuable perspectives of folks like our friend Mina Kiai and the Special Rapporteurs system, there are many other functions of the UN that the U.S. could never hope to replicate as an individual country. The response to the global refugee crisis is one great example. And so that's a place where we have particular concerns about potential cuts and would encourage Congress to take a very close look at
I
it.
share your concern.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say, as someone who's worked with some amazing Foreign Service officers, diplomats over my career, that there are such a large number of FSOs that are deeply committed to issues of human rights and democracy. I think where there's a challenge sometimes at embassies, which is where really interagency coordination happens in practice, is sometimes you have conflicting portfolios, and there's not always coordination that's happening between the diplomatic aid and security portfolio. So if anything, that type of coordination at post could be emphasized and rewarded. And I think one of the small recommendations I made in my testimony is really rewarding those courageous diplomats and development practitioners who put their careers on the line to focus on protecting and defending civic space. Award them annually. Have that reflected in their career evaluation. So I think there are small things that can be done to incentivize even more great work.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's a good suggestion. I raised the question because sometimes I get the feeling that if you're a career officer, that you get rewarded for not making waves. Not necessarily for making waves. And sometimes that means that you don't, I agree. I met some of the finest people I've ever met in our foreign service and serving overseas, but sometimes I've been frustrated by what I've felt is kind of containment rather than, trying to move the ball forward. I also agree that, investing in development early on, in developing a strong civil society early on is important, and maintaining that. And when you were saying that, I couldn't help but think of two countries that I've been involved with over the years. One is El Salvador during the 1980s, and now Colombia. A lot of us worked very hard to try to change our policy in El Salvador and push for a peace process. We pushed for a peace process, and then we kind of walked away. I mean, we funded the war, but we didn't fund the peace. And then you look at the results today. I mean, some of the same problems that led to the war are still in place. Impunity, a judicial system that doesn't work, random killings, a lot of them politically motivated, and we still have the same old problems. In Colombia, we've all worked very hard. We funded that war for a long, long time. Now you have a peace, and with some pretty lofty goals as part of the peace accords. But if they're not funded, and if we're not committed to it, and the international community is not committed to it, then it's just words, because it won't become a reality. So none of this is, unfortunately, none of this is for free. But I always think if you're willing to, invest in wars, maybe you could invest in peace. And it's a radical idea, but sometimes the results are better in the longer term. I'm just trying to, we do a lot of stuff here that I don't know whether it's effective or not. I mean, we have the Prisoners of Conscience campaign, where we all adopt a prisoner of conscience, and we take ownership, and we do speeches, we do letters, and I think that has helped in a lot of ways. But there are some things we do that I think it's like we're going through the motions, that maybe is not as effective as we'd like. I guess, what do you think are the most effective things that we can do in Congress? Passing legislation is one thing. Again, depends on the country and whether there's consensus or whatever. But in terms of responding immediately to crackdowns on civil society, is it calling the ambassador into our offices? Is it giving a speech on the House floor? Is it introducing a resolution that may or may not go anywhere? Is it visiting the country? Is it what do you think are the most effective things that we can do in response to crackdowns? begin with you.
I mean, I think it varies by country. What are the most effective tactics going to be? Sort of the megaphone diplomacy is going to be incredibly effective in certain places where governments care about their public images and where we have very strong aid and security relationships. Other places it may be less advisable to be outspoken, but what I know through interaction with activists is that they appreciate strong, bold statements by policymakers, public officials, when there are human rights crackdowns. And so I think it's hard to generalize, but strong public statements matter. And then as someone who supported CODELs overseas, I know how important it is when
Right.
members of Congress and their staffers meet with civil society leaders, labor, unionists, artists, and the like, but they diversify. They don't just meet with the same 5 people in the country every trip who speak perfect English. They get out and see where change is happening and can hear from different perspectives. So I think those 2 things matter a lot.
Thank you so much for the question, and I think there's no doubt in my mind, and certainly in the mind of Amnesty International, that the work that you and others have done on the Defending Freedoms Project has made a really significant difference for a lot of individual cases. I agree with the comment that it will vary according to the country and the effectiveness of public shame on any particular government administration. But I also think what's important to underline is that addressing an individual case will always have much greater ramifications than just the case of that person. And there's no question that other activists in the country take heart when they see advocacy on behalf of an individual who's been targeted, that they also celebrate when that person wins release from their incarceration, and that gives them inspiration to keep doing the work. So while it's important for the individual on whose behalf you're advocating, there's no question that there are larger ramifications. And that also gives a lot of opportunity for organizations like mine to speak out about the importance of using those cases to make longer-term change. So for us, this is a really critical strategy for us to embrace. Thank you.
I would agree strongly with what has just been said by both of my co-panelists. I would also point to the importance of the demonstration effect of the United States. As we heard earlier in the first panel, it's very important that the United States, regardless of the political moment, makes very clear that we stand for democracy and human rights here and around the world. And any time that politicians engage in nationalist rhetoric or seem to align themselves in some way with forces like that, whether it's in the United States, across Europe, or anywhere else, it needs to be very clear that we consider that unacceptable and fundamentally antithetical to the development and the protection of the democratic fabric.
One, reach out to legislators. We often just focus on government officials or civil society, and we forget the important role of parliaments. And I think there's a way to multilateralize it. I know that you often receive delegations from like-minded governments, and I think we might be able to multilateralize parliamentary engagement with other governments. And then finally, oversight of other agencies and departments. We often work across purposes, specifically when it comes to issues of national security, counterterrorism, and even trade. So I think there might be a way that we have a whole of government approach to try to advance some of these issues.
Well, I think that's a good point. And interesting enough, we just recently met with a group of Canadian parliamentarians who were down here trying to figure out how to coordinate on human rights work. We met with a group of parliamentarians from the UK, same thing. I mean, so, they're actually approaching us and trying to figure out how we can coordinate things, better. So, but let me close with this, because next week is Tibet Lobby Week. And it's one of these issues that that has really troubled me for some time, is our inability to make any progress in influencing China's behavior on Tibet. I mean, again, we talk the talk, we issue statements, we do all that kind of stuff, but yet the government of China continues to destroy religious sites, forcibly move people out of Tibet to other regions so they can disperse the Tibetan population, make it difficult to practice their religion, speak their language, have their, celebrate their culture and their traditions. We're working on a reciprocity bill because I think the statements in and of themselves haven't been enough. But basically, you know, if I'll give the government trying to credit that a year and a half ago they let some of us visit Tibet. I'm not sure any other delegations have been able to visit since, and prior to that I think it was almost a decade before any U.S. Delegation visited Tibet. But the deal is this, you know, as a way to kind of pressure them on respecting the rights of civil societies, to say, look, you know, we're going to treat you like you treat us. So if you don't let journalists and diplomats and people go to Tibet, you know, then, you know, don't expect to come here and go anywhere you want to go. That there's a consequence for that. I mean, the reason why I raise this is we're trying to think a little bit out of the box here on things that might be effective but targeted, you know, that wouldn't hurt regular people, but as a way to try to show that this is serious. Because, I mean, I've been through Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, and nothing has changed. And so I'd just be curious as a last question, because I just got a note that we have to be out here by 3. You know, any recommendations, or how do you approach a situation like the way the Chinese treat the Tibetans?
Thank you, Chairman. You know, one of the greatest hopes we have for improving human rights in China is the movement inside China for human rights. And there's no question that the crackdown on human rights lawyers is having some significant impact. It's a little bit of an indirect way, but I would just note that the more support that you can provide to the human rights lawyers who are being prosecuted and harassed by the Chinese government, the greater the support for the movement indigenously.
And we were in Beijing, we met with some of them. But they had a good criticism, because the U.S. Embassy arranged it before a reception, and they came in the back door and met with us and then left through the back door. And their kind of point was, why are you doing this? Because they all know we're here anyway.
Exactly.
But I think it's not just meeting with them, it's how you meet with them.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you.
I would just say this may be an area, too, where some civil society funding would be helpful, to work with the activists and civil society leaders to help them better organize, advocate, extend their outreach, so they're working with lawyers inside China and other human rights, because there's going to be a link between activism and organizing inside Tibet and organizing and activism inside mainland China.
I would add, Freedom House has produced the China Media Bulletin for many years now, and we've found in our efforts at Chinese language dissemination that there's a huge marketplace for these kinds of projects, real research produced in Chinese language that can be disseminated online for people who are interested within China to really know about what's happening. So I would keep in mind that audience in terms of funding, and also the audience of Chinese students who are here in the United States, who are learning more and more about what might be happening in their home country that they weren't aware of at the time. So any efforts to focus on them and direct information and research to them so they can really understand from a non-biased perspective what's happening would be particularly helpful.
I think it reinforces the point that it's a long game, and sometimes we're not going to be able to achieve any kind of short-term results in governments to foundations. What's fascinating about it is 95% of all the groups that received emergency support under the Lifeline Initiative said that it enabled them to continue to do human rights work. So I think we've got to move to a protective approach.
Well, thank you. I just want to say one thing. You mentioned, you know, the Chinese students or foreign students in general that come here, which I think is a great opportunity for people to understand kind of our perspective on things, and they go back to their respective countries. Although I will just tell you as an aside, with some of the rhetoric on immigration that has gone on here, what I'm hearing from a lot of college presidents, university presidents, is that the number of foreign students that normally would come here from every part of the world, I mean, not just troubled parts of the world, but every part of the world, are diminishing because people are wondering whether they're going to be welcome here, which is kind of an unfortunate byproduct of all the stuff that's gone on. But look, I appreciate all the work that you do, and I hope that we'll stay in touch. But this has been very, very helpful, and we're going to continue to try to find new and innovative ways to make the case to support civil society. And again, I thank you for your time, and I apologize for the interruption and all the other stuff. So thank you. Bye.